One of the most commonly discussed hypothetical confrontations in the Walking Dead fandom is that of the Saviors being pitted against the Whisperers. Fans of the show often ponder whether or not Negan and his empire could subjugate the skin mask wearing freaks in the woods, or whether or not Alpha and Beta could crush the Sanctuary and its puppet states. Well, instead of just answering the question, I decided that this would make for an excellent what if video, similar to some of my more narrative-focused what if videos. Now, before we begin, I gotta explain the state of affairs leading up to this hypothetical scenario. You see, for this story to really function, these Saviors have to be at the very peak of their strength, and so do the Whisperers. So, in order for this to work, we're just gonna have to assume that these events take place prior to the discovery of Alexandria, which means the Saviors will be in their prime with Oceanside, Hilltop, and the Kingdom under their control. Every outpost you can think of is also operational, and the Whisperers themselves are, well, they're doing just fine out in the fucking woods. With that being said, let's get this party started by also reminding you to please like, share, and subscribe. Sorry folks, I just had to get that shameless plug out of the way. We begin our story on a bright and sunny day over at Hilltop, where conditions have been worsening for quite some time due to the insane tax rate levied by the imperialist saviors. For the past few days, Gregory and Jesus had been overseeing scavenging operations which ventured far out into the unexplored northern regions of Virginia. Now the goal was to secure desperately needed medical supplies and firearms, with Jesus secretly hoping to find new settlements for trade and alliance building. But after the last mission had been conducted by Ethan, Craig, Tim, and Marcia, they reported to both Jesus and Gregory that the walkers in the northern regions were behaving strangely. They described undead hordes seemingly stalking them and following their movements without ever fully pursuing them or engaging them. Puzzled and alarmed by this information, Gregory initially considered reporting this intel to Simon. But Jesus argued it wouldn't be smart to get the Saviors involved just yet, as they might just punish Gregory for his cowardice. Gregory then agreed, also realizing that Simon might ask for extra tribute if this information annoyed him. Convinced by this line of reasoning, both Jesus and Gregory ordered Ethan, Craig, Tim, Marcia, Andy, and Crystal to continue scavenging operations in the unexplored regions. And it's now been a few days since the crew led by Ethan left the colony. A perimeter guard on the wall calls for Jesus. When Jesus climbs up to the observation deck, he witnesses something he's never seen: a large group of strangers wearing skin masks. Before Jesus can even speak, the mysterious group of imposing weirdos reveal that they have Ethan, Andy, and Crystal as hostages. Jesus sees this and immediately realizes that Tim, Marcia, and Craig are probably dead. Hilltop has no firearms and nothing is known about this new group. As such, Jesus quickly opts to de-escalate the situation. He does this by asking the group what they want and if there was, perhaps, some sort of misunderstanding, to which Alpha appears walking out of the crowd. She then explained to Jesus that his people had trespassed on her territory, and apparently they attempted to fight back, but it was to no avail. Hearing this revelation, Jesus felt his heart sink, but he then quickly informed Alpha that his people meant her no harm, that they were just struggling and looking for supplies. Upon hearing this excuse, Alpha merely scoffed before berating Jesus with her views on the inferiority of sedentary living. Then, after this short diatribe, Alpha told Jesus she would be leaving Hilltop with a warning, then promptly allowing the hostages to return to the colony safely. Not long after this exchange, Alpha and her people disappeared into the woods. A few minutes later, after tending to Ethan, Andy, and Crystal, Jesus barged into Gregory's office to inform him of what had just happened. And the news left Gregory shaken to his very core, leading him to a very simple conclusion, being that they had no choice but to call in the Saviors. After all, part of their subjugation agreement was that the Saviors would help keep them safe. Jesus begrudgingly agrees and immediately heads to the satellite outpost, the only known outpost in the area. Shortly after Jesus' departure, Gregory pulled Ethan, Andy, and Crystal into his office in order to get a better understanding of what had transpired. The three individuals told Gregory that these savages use skin masks to camouflage their presence around walkers. According to their testimony, a random horde had discovered them in the woods, and these feral freaks jumped out of the horde to abduct them. Gregory then asked them if they had imparted this information to Jesus, to which Ethan confirmed that Jesus was properly informed. Gregory then stood silently for just a few seconds before asking Ethan if he and his crew were willing to do some reconnaissance on this new threat. Crystal immediately rejected the opportunity, but Andy was absolutely gung-ho with the proposition. These Neanderthals killed their friends and Ethan's brother, so if they could help get some intel on their operations in order to aid the Saviors in enacting revenge for them, then yeah, they'd do it. As the sun began to set, Ethan and Andy headed out on their new mission, and Gregory patiently waited in his room, hoping nothing would go wrong. While it may seem like he cares about what happened to his people, what he really wants is to seem as if he's being proactive in the eyes of his savior overlords. Under the cover of a moonlit sky, Jesus arrived at the satellite outpost, being exasperated from the incredibly long hike he had just undergone. The guards at the entrance of the outpost instantly recognized him, and then asked him why the hell he was out at their outpost at such a late hour. Jesus then, without skipping a beat, explained to them, while being out of breath from the long hike, that a new and violent group had been discovered, that these freaks killed 3 of their people, and that they were now preventing them from scavenging for supplies. The guards then looked at each other with some concern, before then briefly looking at Jesus with blank faces. And at that very moment, they invited Jesus to stay the night at the outpost. As Jesus entered the facility, for the first time ever, one of the guards took him into a holding cell, explaining to him that this was just standard procedure. The same guard then went down the hallway to another room, where he radioed the sanctuary. The guard then went on to explain the incident described by Jesus. And after a few minutes, Simon got on the frequency and informed the guard that he would arrive with a small team in the morning. This information was then passed on to Jesus, who breathed a sigh of relief. Part of him was worried that the Saviors would actually just tell him to walk it off. The next day, at around noon, Simon arrived at the outpost with a rod and a 20-man squad. He then busted into Jesus' holding cell in order to interrogate him about this new threat. And after a lengthy conversation and some passive aggressiveness, Simon and his team headed out with Jesus in their truck convoy to check up on the Hilltop colony. And about an hour later, they arrived to Hilltop, only to find it overrun by a sizable walker horde. The walls of the colony were breached in multiple areas, and the Barrington house itself was seemingly burned to the ground. What the fuck? Simon states aloud, being visibly disturbed and also angered by the sight of the ruined colony. Simon may not care for the people of Hilltop, but he does view this as an act of war against the Saviors. Jesus himself could feel his heart shattering into 1,000 pieces, because his people were somehow annihilated by a walker horde. Jesus was now also a man without a tribe, so one can only imagine the grief he was going through. Arat then comments that perhaps this mystery group attacked the colony, breached the walls, and the noise must have attracted a nearby horde. This is an explanation that everyone seems to agree on, despite it being far from the truth. After some debate, Simon elects to send half of his men, led by Arat, out on a recon mission into the northern region. Simon explicitly commands Arat to locate the enemy and then to fall back and report on their whereabouts. But Jesus cautions Simon to reconsider this plan, and in typical fashion, Simon tells him to shut the fuck up and let the pros handle it. He also then informs Jesus that he's coming to the sanctuary with him, as Jesus no longer has a community and maybe they can find him a job at the sanctuary. As the sun begins to set, Arat and her squad begin to set up camp in the woods, hoping that the trees and foliage would act as cover from any potential enemy scouts. You see, she's operating under the assumption that the enemy is a conventional fighting force. She has no idea that the Whisperers don't really use firearms, but rather control walker hordes as both an offensive weapon and also as a defensive shield. All that she's really gathered from Jesus' intel is that these freaks use skin masks to camouflage themselves from the undead. But unbeknownst to her, Alpha and Beta had been tracking their movements off in the distance, under the cover of a small walker horde. You see, prior to the attack on Hilltop, the Whisperers left behind a few scouts in order to ensure that their agreement with Hilltop would not be violated. And when Ethan, Andy, and Crystal were sent out to look for the Whisperers, by direct command of Gregory, these Whisperer scouts detected their activity and followed them until they wandered into Alpha's territory. Then and only then was Alpha informed. And then and only then is when Alpha ordered the total obliteration of the Hilltop colony. The appearance of Arat surprised Alpha and Beta, as they had assumed Hilltop and its people were completely annihilated. Perhaps the colony had allies. Alpha, being somewhat intrigued, ordered Beta to take the horde and a few men and to then capture one of these strangers alive.
Man, I gotta tell you, this shit sucks.
Luke the Savior proclaimed, as he and another dude were on night watch duty at the jerry-rigged campsite.
We drove out here for like 7 hours and there's literally nothing out here.
He then adds as his fellow night guard just looks at him with an annoyed expression.
Shut up, man.
The other man replies as he then starts to light a cigarette.
Give me a cig and I won't beat your ass for talking to me like that.
Luke states before both men then hear bushes ruffling in the background.
You hear that shit?
Luke adds with the other man nodding his head. Around midday, the following day, Negan calls for a meeting in his conference room. All of his lieutenants are present for the session, and Jesus is brought in by Simon, who then orders Jesus to explain everything that he knows to Negan and his inner circle. After some exposition, Negan asks Simon if he's heard back from Arad, to which he informs Negan that contact had not yet been made. Dwight explains that the lack of contact has him a bit worried, to which Simon responds by merely asking him to have some faith in Herat. Gavin then opines that perhaps this new community isn't worth the hassle, that perhaps Gregory deserved to be annihilated for potentially violating the deal Jesus spoke of. Jesus then explains that they didn't violate the deal, but Gavin retorts that perhaps Gregory sent out some scouts after Jesus had left for the satellite outpost. Jesus then thinks to himself that such an act wouldn't be out of character for Gregory. Despite this, Simon then explains to Gavin that whether or not Gregory got Hilltop destroyed isn't the issue. This new group is a threat that just burned down Savior property, to which Regina tells Simon that it probably wasn't smart to send Arad out on a mission by herself with just 10 men. After all, this mystery group managed to wipe out an entire colony overnight. But before Simon could even respond, Negan orders Regina to radio all outposts to be on high alert for skin mask wearing weirdos, and to also be on the lookout for walker hordes behaving strangely. Negan then goes on to agree with Simon on the whole notion that this new community is a threat that needs to be brought to its knees for future subjugation. The labor at Hilltop has to be replaced, because people are a resource. After a healthy back and forth, everyone comes to the conclusion that the Saviors have to organize a strike team to search, locate, and force this new enemy to capitulate to Savior subjugation. And once the meeting was adjourned, Negan called Jesus over to have a private discussion with him. Negan then went on to explain to Jesus that he could use an excellent fighter and scout. He's heard nothing but good things about him from Gregory. He also appreciates that Jesus came to the Saviors for aid. Negan then goes on to give Jesus his condolences, assuring him that Hilltop would be avenged. Jesus, on the other hand, just sat there silently for a few seconds before accepting his new role as a savior at the sanctuary. Negan was happy to hear Jesus' acceptance of his offer. But before Negan could go on to show Jesus his new living quarters, a call came in over the radio directly to Negan. It was Regina. Apparently, one of the explosive traps on the highway was triggered by a horde. Negan then tells Regina to handle it before taking Jesus on a tour of the sanctuary. Beta goes on to beat Luke like wholesale carpet for a few minutes before Alpha then demands Luke to explain the highway explosive tripwires. Luke explains that he had no idea they even existed, but that perhaps they were just part of the Sanctuary's many defensive anti-walker networks. He then goes on to tell Alpha that a ton of the Savior's assets are on a need-to-know basis, and that only the inner circle is privy to all-encompassing information. Beta then looks at Alpha with a look of disapproval. It was Alpha who killed Arad, since she wouldn't capitulate to her demands. At that time, Arad explained to Alpha that the Saviors would wipe her and her people out, that Negan's empire was so vast and grand that Alpha and her people were facing total annihilation. This information obviously forced Alpha to strike while the element of surprise was still on her side, because to her the Saviors were clearly aiming to retaliate, and thus this constituted, to Alpha, that the Saviors were an existential threat. As such, she managed to force Luke to give her the location of the sanctuary. But now, with the horde likely being spotted, Alpha was forced to reduce her attack force by 25% because she didn't want to put all of her eggs in one basket. That being said, she still allows the majority of her forces and walkers to continue the attack, placing Dante in charge, with the expressed goal of infiltrating the sanctuary in the middle of the chaos if the assault fails. After a quick tour of the sanctuary, Negan finally ended up showing Jesus his room. Jesus went on to thank Negan for his hospitality, with Negan then cracking a joke about Jesus' name. Then, suddenly, out of nowhere, Dwight barges into the room, explaining to Negan that the Walker Horde was reported moving straight towards the sanctuary. He also goes on to explain that the Horde is massive in size. Negan reacted by saying,
What the fuck?
before it suddenly clicked in his mind. The skin masks aren't just camouflage like the Walker Guts technique. The masks also help these freaks to control the hordes. That would explain the unusually large horde being present at Hilltop. It would also explain why the horde ignored the sound from the explosion, and also the irregular Walker behavior Jesus mentioned in his testimony. Negan then immediately gets his radio and orders Regina to mobilize everyone at the sanctuary for an expected attack. He then tells Dwight to radio to all outposts that reinforcements are needed at the sanctuary ASAP. And about a half an hour later, the horde smashes into the sanctuary's defenses, and an all-out battle for survival begins. Alright folks, that's it for part 1 of this lengthy what if. Part 2 of this story will be out next Friday on the 10th of October. If y'all like this sort of content, please like, share, and subscribe. Click the bell as well, that way you may be notified when I publish a new video. And always remember that you may opine anytime if you feel so inclined, down in the comments section. I'm Captain Gold and hope to see you in my next Gold Standard video.